Hello, welcome to the Queering History series. I'm your host and I'll be your guide through this series where we explore what LGBTQ+ history, or queer history as historians often call it, is all about and why it is important for everyone to know and still matters today. In this video, we are discussing bisexual or bi history. We will explore the history of the bisexual community by breaking down what the bisexual identity is, going over a brief timeline of how bisexual history has developed, and then talking about two important bisexual historical figures. You can also find a link to our blog on today's video and some further reading in the link in the description. Throughout the video, we'll pause and do some fun activities together, so be ready for these as well. You can download a worksheet to follow along with the video and complete these activities from the activities link in the description. You can complete them by yourself, or with a partner, or as a class. This video is about 25 minutes long, but may take longer to watch if you decide to complete the activities. You can spend as much time on these as you need. In the videos in the rest of the series, we will look at some examples of LGBTQ+ history in depth and explore what they can tell us about what it was like to be queer in the past and what they can show us about our society today. So stay tuned and subscribe to not miss these. If you are new to the channel or topic of LGBTQ+ history, then check out our introduction video in the link in the description for an overview of the LGBTQ+ community and queer British history. If you enjoy what follows, please like and subscribe. You can also find our social media in the description as well. Now, let's discover some bisexual history. Before we get into this video properly, let's go through some definitions and information relating to the bi-identity. Firstly, let's go over identity, sexuality and gender again if you have not watched our introduction video. Your identity is the different parts of you that make you you, such as your gender and sexual orientation, culture and nationality, and religion and upbringing. Sexual orientation, or sexuality, is made up of how you experience romantic and sexual attraction and forms a part of your identity. Gender is how you feel in terms of whether you are a boy or a girl or somewhere in between. It is expressed and performed on the outside. For example, if you feel like a girl on the inside, you may wear dresses on the outside to show your gender. As in our society, this is how some girls express their femininity. It also makes up your identity. It is different from your sex, which is either male or female, and what you were born as. Your gender may or may not be the same as your sex. Now that we understand these terms, who does the word bisexual refer to? If you have watched our introduction video, can you remember? Or if not, can you work it out? Pause the video and see if you can create a definition of bisexual in your worksheet or on some paper, and resume when you are ready for the answer. Now that you've had a chance to work it out, let's see if you are right. Bisexual refers to people who have romantic and sexual attraction towards more than one gender. They can be men, women, or non-binary people who are attracted to men, women, and non-binary people. Non-binary people are people who identify outside of the man or woman binary. They identify with a gender outside of this. To learn about non-binary people in depth, check out our transgender history video in the description. But what makes bisexuals different to lesbians and gay people is that they do not just experience homosexual same-sex attraction, but also heterosexual opposite-sex attraction. A bisexual woman, for example, would experience homosexual attraction by being attracted to other women, but also heterosexual attraction by being attracted to men. Remember, being heterosexual is when you experience romantic or sexual attraction only towards the opposite sex or gender. So, a man who loves women and women who love men are heterosexual or straight. Experiencing heterosexual attraction does not make bisexuals straight though, as they also experience homosexual attraction. This is also true the other way round. Being bisexual is also been called an umbrella term for other identities that experience attraction to more than one gender, such as pansexual. Some bisexuals also have preferences for certain genders, and some like each gender equally, but they still fall under the bisexual umbrella. Bisexual people also make up the largest portion of the LGBTQ+ community. Bisexual people have a unique place in society because of their capacity to experience both homosexual and heterosexual attraction. This is because our society is heteronormative, so it assumes heterosexuality to be the default in people and sets standards for society. So often LGBTQ+ people are ignored or not as represented, resulting in homophobia, a hatred or prejudice against LGBTQ+ people. So, because of homophobia and heteronormativity in society, bisexuals may feel pressure to only express their heterosexual attraction rather than their homosexual attraction, because of pressure from society to be straight and to avoid homophobia. In the past, when being LGBTQ+ was illegal, bisexual people may have also done this for their safety too. This idea of only expressing their heterosexual attraction may look like bisexual men only expressing their attraction to women and ignoring their attraction to other men or choosing not to act on it because they feel pressured to be heterosexual, for example. In the past particularly, because of heteronormativity and homophobia too, bisexual people who did choose to express their homosexual attraction as well as their heterosexual attraction were also seen as either gay or lesbian, and their ability to experience both types of attraction was often ignored because they are put into a box of generally being not heterosexual. We will get more into this idea soon though. As well, our society is also patriarchal, so it is structured so that men have more power and sets a specific standard of what it means to be a man or woman. So, patriarchy, alongside homophobia, also influenced how bisexual people express their identities, as there were differences in how it was thought that men and women should be. We will go over this in more detail soon. So because of their attraction to multiple genders, bisexuals have the potential to fit into both heterosexual, patriarchal mainstream society and the LGBTQ+ community too, which comes with several advantages and disadvantages. Let's pause before we go into the next part of the video. Now that we understand the bisexual identity, what kinds of issues do you think that bisexual people might have faced in the past? What kinds of issues might bisexual people face today? We mentioned the idea that there are advantages and disadvantages to how bisexuals experience attraction to multiple genders. Can you think of what these could be to help you? Pause and discuss your ideas or have a think to yourself. Write your ideas in your worksheet and resume the video when you are ready to continue. Now that you've begun to think about the types of issues that bisexual people have faced in the past, let's see if we can develop your ideas with this timeline. Below, you can see a general timeline that relates to bisexual history from ancient times to now in Europe. The timeline does not include every event and figure in the history of the bisexual community, but some of the key things that show how the meaning and idea of being bisexual developed throughout history. Before we start, if you've already watched our lesbian or gay history videos, you may remember that we said a lot of bisexual history overlaps with lesbian and gay history, as they were not thought of as being separate identities in the past until much later on. So, some of what you see below may overlap with these other videos, but this is because bisexuals share a lot of history with gay people and lesbians, as well as their own history. Check out the lesbian and gay history videos for more details on this history in the links below. Firstly, on our timeline in ancient Greece, sexuality was considered more as something someone did, so there was no idea of being bisexual back then. Sexual acts between men were tolerated though because ancient Greece was patriarchal and society viewed men's sexuality as more important than women's, so they were free to do as they wished. Ancient Greek men were supposed to eventually marry the opposite sex though. Because some men were attracted to men and women, they could easily fit into this standard by marrying women and were praised for having prior relationships with men, as it was thought that this gave them wisdom. Next, in the Middle Ages, after the rise of Christianity in Europe, homosexuality was still thought of as something someone did, but was called sodomy, which was the act of two men having sex and was seen as a sin. In 1179, Pope Alexander III made it punishable by excommunication, so kicking you out of Catholicism if you were not clergy, or forcing you to be a monk if you were clergy. As medieval society only thought of same-sex attraction in terms of the act of sodomy, there was no concept of being bisexual at this time either. This is an example of how bisexual history overlaps with gay and lesbian history, as they were not seen as separate identities and ideas yet. Similarly, in the early modern period in Europe, up until the 19th century, sodomy and female same-sex acts were recognised and outlawed by monarchs and governments, as well as the church. During this period, sexuality was still thought of as an act, but it was different for men and women. In the 17th and 18th centuries, men who did sodomy began to be known as sodomites, so people who did sodomy, and acts of sex between women began to be known as tribadism, an ancient Greek word for lesbian, and those who did it were called tribads. So, bisexuals who acted on their same-sex attraction were either thought of as sodomite or tribad, even though they experienced heterosexual attraction too, as back then you were either homosexual or not. In the 19th century, however, European society began to consider sexuality less as something that someone did, but more of something that someone is. This was because of the rise of medicine labelling people who experience homosexual attraction as sexual deviants or diseased. It was also still illegal in Europe at this time. So, as sexuality became something to be studied, scientists began to research it further and discovered that there were people who experienced homosexual and heterosexual attraction. In 1892, Charles Gilbert Chadwick was the first to use the term bisexual to mean attraction to men and women in the English language, in a translation of Psychopathia Sexualis, a book by the German scientist Kraft Ebing. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud, known as the father of psychoanalysis, the study of the mind, developed the theory of bisexuality. He argued that everyone was born bisexual and people became homosexual or heterosexual later on in childhood. However, his theory on bisexuality has since been rejected by scientists because it relied on the outdated idea that people were either heterosexual or homosexual, which as we know today is not true. It was not until 1947 that European and Western society began to see sexuality as being more than just being homosexual or heterosexual. The American scientist Alfred Kinsey conducted interviews with thousands of people and used his findings to create a scale of sexuality called the Kinsey scale. The scale was released in 1948 and goes from 0 to 6, with 0 being completely heterosexual and 6 being completely homosexual, and number 3 being bisexual. It showed that actually a lot more people in society were bisexual than previously thought, and provided a new way of thinking about what sexuality is. It also helped bisexual people to describe themselves. Although some scientists today question his study because of his methods, it marked the start of bisexuality becoming its own identity. Since then, in the 1970s, in Britain for example, the term bisexual began to be widely recognised as separate to being lesbian or gay. Bisexuals played a key role in the activism that the LGBTQ+ community did to fight for their rights for equality in the 1970s and 80s. And in 1981, the London Bisexual Group was founded especially for bisexuals, and even more bisexual organisations popped up across the country throughout the 1980s. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s, whilst difficult for the whole LGBTQ+ community, affected bisexual men in a unique way, because as they experienced sexual attraction to both men and women, they were seen as carriers of the disease to the heterosexual population by spreading it to women. AIDS is a disease that HIV becomes. It is a virus that is contracted through sexual contact and blood, and as the LGBTQ+ community had much less access to contraceptives and sex education, AIDS spread fast in these communities. In the 1990s, bisexuality continued to develop into a separate community and identity in itself in Western and European societies. In America, some bisexual groups even made the Bisexual Manifesto in the 1990s that defined bisexuality and showed it to also include attraction to transgender and non-binary people. Since then, in the 21st century, bisexual people amongst other LGBTQ+ people have gained rights such as to adopt, marry and serve in the military. However, their history is still not finished, as it is still not accepted by everyone in Europe or the world. Now that we have completed the timeline, we understand how being bisexual has developed in Europe over the centuries to what it is today. Pause the video and have another look over the timeline. What do you notice about the dates and events? What do you notice about how ideas surrounding being bisexual changed? What do you think life was like for bisexuals in the past? Discuss these questions using the timeline to help you, write your answers in the worksheet and resume the video when you're ready to continue. Some things that you may have written about the dates and events in the timeline could include how in many of them bisexuality was either not known of at all or not thought of as separate from being homosexual or heterosexual until much later on in the timeline. As well, you may have noticed, as we discussed earlier, just how much of bisexual history overlaps with gay and lesbian history because of how it was thought of in the past. In terms of how it changed over history, you may have noticed that it changed from being not known at all to being put in the same box as being gay or straight, depending on how bisexual people express themselves, and then to a separate identity to being gay or lesbian with its own community. Life of bisexual people in the past may have been different depending on who they were and if they expressed any homosexual attraction or not. For those who did, it may have been quite dangerous to be associated with being gay or lesbian because of the negative beliefs about it and laws against it. For those who chose not to for whatever reason, it may have felt quite isolating and confusing to have to live up to standards of society, however their lives may have been less dangerous. Now that you are familiar with how gay history is developed, let's discuss some examples of prominent bisexual historical figures. Below, you can see two extracts. They are both written about Oscar Wilde, a famous Victorian playwright and LGBTQ+ historical figure, by Ari Adet in 2005 and Nicholas Reed Denton in 2012. They each describe Wilde's sexual orientation. Take a moment to pause the video and read these extracts. Compare and contrast what both of these scholars say about Wilde's sexuality. To help you, think about what is each scholar saying about Wilde. Is what they are saying similar or different? Pause the video to compare the extracts and write down your ideas on the worksheet. When you're ready to continue and look at some ideas, press play. Now that you've had a chance to compare them, let's go over them. Ari Adet describes Wilde as a well-known homosexual who expressed this by being effeminate, a Victorian word for a feminine man. He also says that although Wilde had 2 children, he continued to present himself as homosexual in public by wearing the badge of French homosexuals. Nicholas Reed Denton describes Wilde as a bisexual because it was known that he was attracted to men and women and loved his family and wife. However, this aspect of his life was ignored during his trial in 1895, the affairs that he had with men. What the extracts say about Wilde's sexuality is similar, as they both show that Wilde experienced homosexual attraction through his affair and how he presented himself in public. But Denton says that he was bisexual rather than homosexual. So both of these extracts also tell us that Wilde's sexuality is argued about by scholars, as they each say different things about it. So why have some scholars argued that Wilde was bisexual and others that he was homosexual? Before we answer this question, let's talk a bit more about who Oscar Wilde was so we understand him some more. Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin in 1854 and died in 1900. He was born to upper-class parents Sir William Wilde and Jane Francesco Elgee. Wilde studied at Trinity College in Dublin and in 1874 studied at Oxford University, where he fell in love with art but believed that art should be made for the sake of it. As an adult, he was known as eccentric, witty, and an advocate for art and beauty. He also began to publish his first plays and poems. In 1884, he married Constance Mary Lloyd, and they had 2 children, as we mentioned earlier. He often wrote her love letters and spoke highly of her. Wilde became most popular after he published The Picture of Dorian Gray, about a very handsome man that makes a deal with the devil to stay young forever, whilst his portrait ages instead. The book was controversial in the media at the time and got Wilde a lot of attention. Around this time, he met Lord Alfred Bruce Douglas, who he called Bosie. The two had an affair which put Wilde in a dangerous position, as sodomy was still illegal and punishable by prison. Bosie's father had caught on that Wilde was having a relationship with his son and tried to blackmail him. So, Wilde took Bosie's father to court for libel in 1895. Libel is the crime of saying things that are not true about someone. However, the trial was turned on to Wilde instead in a huge scandal, and his homosexuality in relationship with Bosie was investigated. He was found guilty of indecent behaviour and sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. After his sentence, he moved to France to live out the rest of his life. So, as Wilde was married to a woman he appeared to love but had an affair with a man, his sexual orientation has been hard for scholars to understand. It is not certain whether he married his wife in order to live up to the expectation for Victorian men to marry women, or whether he genuinely loved her too, as we have seen from the extracts we read. Although we may never know for sure how Wilde considered his sexuality, we can answer the question of why some historians have been debating whether he was gay or bisexual, why it is now more widely thought that he was bisexual. First of all, as we have already touched on our timeline, before the 20th century, society thought that you could only either be homosexual or heterosexual, and it was illegal to be homosexual. So this impacted how Wilde was viewed by the people around him and consequently by scholars and historians. This is because it shaped how people of his time wrote about him, either in the media or during his trial. He would have been written as being homosexual because there was no popular idea of being bisexual at the time, and because in the trial they were trying to prove he was a homosexual, people would have focused on this. So, scholars that read from sources that people in the media and who were in his trial wrote also saw him as a homosexual because that was what he was portrayed as. This would have also influenced their opinions of his sexuality and caused them to question his attraction to his wife. Secondly, the majority of historians who consider Wilde to be homosexual wrote their ideas in the late 20th century and early 2000s. During this time, being bisexual was only just becoming to be thought of as a separate identity to being gay or lesbian. So Ada, for example, who wrote in 2005, considered Wilde to be homosexual, but in the early 2010s, when Benton wrote his description of Wilde as bisexual, being bi was fully recognised as how we consider it today. As a result of society being more aware of bisexuality, some scholars that have gone back and studied Wilde now consider him more as an early bisexual, and that previous scholars had ignored his attraction to women and his wife to focus on his relationship with Bosie. So, whether Wilde was bisexual or not, his legacy and the debate surrounding his bisexuality can teach us several things. It shows that bisexuality has only recently begun to be known of by scholars in society, and that it has become a new way of thinking about certain queer people in history and could enrich what we know about them. If Wilde is considered bisexual, his legacy also shows that there were bisexual people in the 19th century, and that some were able to express their same-sex and heterosexual attraction by marrying women and having affairs with men. This shows that being bisexual has existed long before it's been thought of today, except it was just not known of at the time. As well, the debate over his sexuality as being gay or bisexual also reflects some of the issues that some bisexuals face today, as only being seen as straight or gay and having their bisexuality ignored, so he is still relevant to bisexuals today. What can you remember about Oscar Wilde? Quickly pause the video and answer these questions below in your worksheet to see if you can remember what you learned. Resume the video when you're ready for the answers. What was the name of the book that Wilde wrote that was controversial in the media and got him lots of attention? What universities did Wilde attend? When did Wilde marry his wife Constance Mary Lloyd, who tried to blackmail Wilde? In what year was Wilde on trial for being homosexual? Now that you've had a go, let's go over the answers. Number 1 was Wilde got attention for the book called The Picture of Dorian Gray. Number 2 was he attended Trinity College in Dublin and Oxford University. Number 3 was he married his wife in 1884. Number 4 was Bosie's father tried to blackmail him. And finally, number 5 was Wilde was on trial in 1895. So that is all for our first bisexual figure in this video. Now let's take another look at another important but quite different figure in bisexual history. Below, you can see 2 extracts. One is a letter written by Amrita Shergill, a famous early 20th century Indian-Hungarian artist, to her mother. The other is by the scholar Ozvara about Shergill. Each extract describes her sexual orientation. Take a moment to pause the video and read these extracts. Compare and contrast how Shergill thought of her sexual orientation and how Zvara describes it, the impression that each extract gives of her. To help you, think about questions like how does Shergill describe her sexual orientation? How does Zvara describe it? Is what they are saying similar or different? What impression does each extract give of Shergill? Pause the video to compare the extracts and think about or discuss what they can show us about Shergill, and write down your ideas in the worksheet. When you are ready to continue and look at some ideas, press play. Now that you've had a chance to compare and think about the 2 extracts, let's go over them. In the letter to her mother, Shergill is saying that she did not have a relationship with a woman called Marie Louise, and she does not like everything about men, so she would like to pursue a relationship with a woman, suggesting that she was an early bisexual. In the extract about Shergill, the scholar Ozvara describes her as having affairs with a variety of men throughout her life, and that there are rumours about her being bisexual throughout Europe and India. They also say that she somehow never seemed fully happy with her partners. Both the letter and what Zvara has written about Shergill's sexuality are similar, as they both show that she could have been bisexual and had or wanted to have relationships with women. They also show that she was unfulfilled by the relationships she had, as in the letter she says there are disadvantages to men, and Zvara observes that she never seemed fully happy. But they are different as well, as Zvara says that her bisexuality in relationships with women is just a rumour. However, Shergill shows that perhaps that being bisexual is not just a rumour, as she says that she would like to have a relationship with a woman. The impression that each extract gives of Shergill is also quite different. The letter shows her to be clever, rebellious and creative through how she speaks to her mother, especially for her age, as she was 16 when she wrote it. It also shows that she was self-aware of her sexual orientation. But, from reading how Zvara describes her sexuality, she comes across as quite promiscuous, unhappy and infamous, which is famous for a bad reason, where they say that she had relationships with married and unmarried men, caught diseases from them, was rumoured to have affairs with women too, and was never fully satisfied by anyone. So why are the impressions that we get of Shergill and her sexuality from her letters so different to what some scholars have written about her said? Before we answer this question, let's talk more about who she was so we understand her a bit more. Amrita Shergill was an artist of Indian and Hungarian descent. She lived from 1913 to 1941. She was born in Budapest to wealthy upper-class parents. From a young age, she was very good at drawing and she studied art in Paris. Throughout her life, she travelled between Hungary, France and India. She painted poorer communities and women in India who were under ruthless colonial rule at the time. She moved permanently to Simla in India in 1934. Despite winning awards for her paintings, she made very little money from art, but as her husband Dr. Victor Egan and her family were very wealthy, she could put all of her time into painting. She died suddenly at the age of 28 after her husband gave her an abortion, which was an operation to stop being pregnant. After her death, her paintings became valuable, and she is known as one of the greatest women artists of the early 20th century. As she had the wealth to support her lifestyle, she had the independence to have many lovers alongside her work, which included men and women. But, unfortunately, her mother did not approve of her having female partners and burned most of the letters that she had written about her relationships with them, so that they were not known. So, from what we know about Shergill's life, she was a well-educated, talented artist with a strong legacy, who was wealthy and had relationships with men and women. So why have some scholars discussed Shergill's sexuality in a way that gives a negative impression of her? There may be several reasons behind this. First of all, in the 1920s in Europe, being homosexual was still illegal, as we know from our timeline. In India, it was also illegal because when Shergill was alive, it belonged to the British and Portuguese empires who forced their ideas about sexuality and gender onto Indian society. So, because of her mixed heritage and upper-class status, she was pressured by her family's cultures and society to only act on heterosexual attraction, and evidence of her attraction to women was burnt, as we mentioned. So, her bisexuality can appear to some people as a rumour because of this. As well, being bisexual was not known of in her lifetime, so Shergill was seen as promiscuous and unsatisfiable for having relationships with men and women, and was even called reckless by the author Khushwant Singh, as she had abortions and caught sexual diseases. This also added to the negative impressions of her that people had because of her bisexuality. So, these views that people had of her when she was alive influenced how her sexuality was discussed by scholars, so even though they may not mean to show her in a negative way, they do because of how she was seen in the evidence that they look at about her life. As well, her being a woman also impacts how her being bisexual has been considered because as European and colonial Indian societies were patriarchal, the sexuality of women was seen as something to be controlled. So, as she was a bisexual, mixed-race woman, this would have also added to the ideas that she was promiscuous or reckless, as her Indian and Hungarian cultures viewed her lifestyle as shameful for a woman. Because of these three things, her sexuality was seen as negative, which shaped how some scholars describe it. So, Amrita Shergill's legacy teaches us several things. Firstly, her story shows how bisexuality in women of certain cultures and social classes has been considered by people, and how this influenced how scholars have considered them. As well, her story also shows that being bisexual occurred in people of many backgrounds, and that some bisexual people were able to express this by having relationships with men and women, as they had the wealth to sustain their lifestyle and avoid danger. Finally, her legacy is still relevant to many bisexual women today who feel pressured to be in heterosexual relationships by their families, cultures, or society, or have been seen as promiscuous because of their sexual attraction to multiple genders. What can you remember about Amrita Shergill? Quickly pause the video and answer these questions below in your worksheet to see if you can remember what you learned. Resume the video when you're ready for the answers. Which 3 countries did Shergill live in throughout her life? Where did she study art? In what year did she move to Simla? Who burned her letters that spoke about her relationships with women? How old was Shergill when she died? Now that you've had a go, let's go over the answers. Number 1 was she lived in India, France, and Hungary. Number 2 was that she studied art in Paris. Number 3 was she moved to Simla in 1934. Number 4 was her mother burnt her letters. And finally, number 5 was she died at only 28 years old. That is all for our second important bisexual historical figure. It is also all for the video. Thank you so much for watching and taking part in this video. Let's quickly recap what we learned before we go. We explored what the bisexual identity is, we looked at a brief timeline of how the idea of being bisexual has changed throughout history, and we studied 2 supposed bisexual historical figures, Oscar Wilde and Amrita Shergill. We learned that bisexual people are unique because they experience attraction to multiple genders and can fit into heterosexual mainstream society and the LGBTQ+ community, and looked at how society's views of bisexuality can shape how bisexual historical figures are remembered and thought of. For now though, I will say goodbye. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video for more content, and check out the link in the description for further reading and resources. Also follow us on social media. You can find our Twitter, Instagram and Facebook pages in the description too. Goodbye and see you in the next video!